I told you to keep your hands where I can see them. What part of that don't you get? My hands are right here, officer. Don't get smart with me. Driving this fancy truck, Yeah, you think you're special. Let me guess, borrowed it from your boss? I'm cooperating. What's the reason for the stop? Reason is you were speeding and you fit the description. You know which description, don't you? In a moment, a man's ordinary drive home became a national story that would shake the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Police Department to its foundation and force systemic reforms that would affect how law enforcement operates across an entire state. His name was Agent Derek Harlan, a decorated FBI special agent with distinguished service in the Bureau's Violent Crime Task Force. He had spent the better part of a decade training both federal agents and local law enforcement officers on constitutional policing standards, de-escalation tactics, and proper arrest procedures. He had testified in federal court as an expert witness. He had received formal commendations for excellence in criminal investigations. I was respected by colleagues, feared by criminals, and trusted by the communities he served. But on this evening, none of that professional reputation, none of those credentials, none of that experience would matter even slightly. Because on this particular night, Agent Derek Harlan would find himself on the wrong side of a traffic stop that had absolutely nothing to do with any traffic violation, and everything to do with the color of his skin, and the assumptions that two police officers made the moment they saw a black man driving an expensive vehicle through an affluent neighborhood. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from, and make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's story involves a highway patrol officer who tried to arrest a sitting federal judge during a routine traffic stop, not knowing the judge was on his way to a judicial ethics conference. You absolutely will not want to miss it. Agent Derek Harlan had just finished a brutally long day of reviewing complex evidence in a massive federal fraud case involving millions of dollars in wire transfers, dozens of shell companies, and a network of potential defendants that stretched across 6 states. The case file sat on the passenger seat of his vehicle in a locked aluminum briefcase containing documents that were classified as law enforcement sensitive and protected by multiple federal statutes regarding unauthorized disclosure. His brain was still actively processing details from depositions he had sat through earlier that day, financial records he had analyzed line by line for hours, witness statements that would need to be corroborated through additional investigation, and forensic accounting reports that traced money movements through complex international transactions. He merged onto Interstate 77, heading north toward his home in the suburb of Huntersville, a quiet residential area outside downtown Charlotte, where he lived with his wife Vanessa and their 2 daughters, Nia and Jada. The September sun had just dipped below the western horizon, leaving the sky painted in deep oranges and purples and reds that would have been beautiful and worth appreciating if Agent Derek Harlan had been in any mental state to notice such things. But he was exhausted in a way that went beyond simple physical tiredness. His shoulders ached from sitting in uncomfortable conference room chairs all day. His eyes were strained from reading financial documents printed in absurdly small font sizes. His lower back complained loudly from hours of immobility and meetings that seemed to stretch on forever. All he wanted in the entire world at that specific moment was to get home to his family, eat whatever dinner Vanessa had saved for him in the kitchen, maybe watch something mindless and entertaining on television to decompress, and then collapse into bed before exhaustion physically forced him there, whether he was ready or not. Traffic on the interstate was unusually light for the evening. Just a scattered and sparse flow of vehicles heading home from work, or heading out for evening activities, or running late errands. Agent Derek Harlan's black Chevrolet Tahoe, less than a couple of years old and purchased entirely with his own hard-earned money from his FBI salary, moved steadily and smoothly in the right lane at exactly the posted speed limit, precisely matching it with his cruise control locked on with typical law enforcement precision. The vehicle was registered in his own name, with current tags clearly visible on the rear license plate, and all insurance documentation properly filed and stored in the glove compartment. Every single light on the vehicle functioned properly and had been inspected recently during routine maintenance. The windows were professionally tinted but well within North Carolina's strict legal limits that Agent Derek Harlan knew by heart from his law enforcement training. There was absolutely nothing whatsoever about either the vehicle itself or his driving behavior that would justify any police attention under any legitimate law enforcement standard that existed anywhere in the United States legal system. But legitimate law enforcement standards were not what was about to determine the next stretch of Agent Derek Harlan's life. Agent Derek Harlan first became consciously aware of the patrol car when he noticed it in his rearview mirror, approximately some car lengths behind him, matching his exact speed with precision, staying in precisely the same lane position without variation. At first, this observation triggered no concern whatsoever in his mind. State troopers and local police officers use this particular stretch of Interstate 77 regularly for routine patrol activities. Being followed by a patrol car on a public highway did not necessarily mean anything significant or problematic. Police vehicles had to travel on the same roads as everyone else, after all, and sometimes they just happened to be going in the same direction as other traffic. But after he had driven for some distance with a cruiser maintaining the exact same following distance without any variation, never getting closer, never falling further back, never changing lanes, never passing him to continue on to some other destination, Agent Derek Harlan's deeply ingrained law enforcement instincts began to activate in the back of his mind. He had personally conducted enough surveillance operations during his FBI career, had followed enough suspects and targets to recognize immediately and instinctively when someone was deliberately tracking and following a target vehicle rather than simply driving in the same direction by random coincidence. Agent Derek Harlan checked his speedometer again with a quick downward glance. It was locked perfectly in place by the cruise control system. He checked his lane position carefully in his mirrors, perfectly centered between the white lines, no drifting whatsoever to either side. He verified visually in his rearview mirror that all his taillights were illuminating properly in the gathering darkness of early evening. Everything was completely in order. There was no possible legitimate reason for any law enforcement interest in his vehicle or his driving behavior. Then, without any warning whatsoever, without any change in Agent Derek Harlan's driving, without any traffic violation of any kind occurring, the red and blue emergency lights on the patrol car suddenly activated, flashing brightly and unmistakably in the dimming evening light. Agent Derek Harlan's first emotional reaction was genuine confusion rather than concern or fear. He knew with absolute certainty, based on his own direct observation and his own careful attention to his driving, that he had committed no traffic violation of any description. His vehicle was completely legal in every respect. His driving was entirely legal and proper. His speed was exactly correct. His lane positioning was absolutely perfect. There was simply no legitimate basis whatsoever for a traffic stop. But he also knew the established protocols that governed these situations. Protocols that he had personally taught to countless civilians in community outreach programs that the FBI conducted regularly in neighborhoods across Charlotte and throughout North Carolina. The protocols were straightforward and clear. Signal clearly your intention to stop. Slow down gradually and safely. Find a safe and well-lit location to pull over. Turn off your engine completely. Place your hands where the approaching officer can see them clearly. Remain polite and compliant regardless of circumstances, and allow the interaction to proceed according to established legal procedures and professional standards. Agent Derek Harlan activated his right turn signal clearly and obviously, began slowing gradually and smoothly without any sudden braking, and carefully pulled his Tahoe onto the wide paved shoulder of the interstate near the exit, deliberately choosing a specific spot that was positioned directly under a bright streetlight and immediately adjacent to a quick-trip gas station whose parking lot was extremely well lit and currently had customers clearly visible moving around between the gas pumps and the convenience store entrance. The location choice was completely deliberate and tactical on Agent Derek Harlan's part. He understood from both his extensive training and his years of practical experience that visibility and the presence of civilian witnesses provided both a level of safety for everyone involved in the interaction and a crucial mechanism for accountability if anything went wrong during the encounter. He shifted the transmission into park, turned off the engine completely, lowered his driver's side window all the way down to facilitate communication, and placed both of his hands on top of the steering wheel at the 10 and 2 positions, where they would be clearly and obviously visible to any officer who approached the vehicle. His FBI credentials were in his wallet in his right front pocket. His service weapon, a standard issue, Glock 22 chambered in .40 caliber, was secured in a biometric fingerprint safe that was bolted permanently to the floor of the rear cargo area, which was standard operating procedure for FBI agents who might need to secure their weapons quickly in various unpredictable situations throughout their workday. Through his side mirror, Agent Derek Harlan watched carefully and analytically as the officer exited the patrol car and began walking toward his vehicle with purposeful strides. The officer's movements and overall body language immediately registered as deeply problematic to Agent Derek Harlan's extensively trained eye. The aggressive forward-leaning posture that suggested confrontation rather than professional interaction, the right hand resting on top of the holstered service weapon in a way that clearly suggested readiness to draw the weapon rather than simple habitual positioning, the facial expression that conveyed obvious hostility and suspicion rather than professional neutrality or appropriate caution. All of these observable signs indicated very clearly that this was not going to be a routine professional traffic stop conducted according to proper procedures and legal standards. The officer who approached Agent Derek Harlan's driver's side window was Officer Curtis Langley, a veteran of the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Police Department with a personnel file that Agent Derek Harlan would later discover during the litigation process was absolutely filled with citizen complaints spanning his career with the department. 18 formal complaints filed over his career, 16 of them specifically involving black motorists, all describing remarkably similar patterns of problematic behavior. Aggressive and hostile demeanor toward drivers, unwarranted vehicle searches conducted without proper consent or probable cause, false accusations designed specifically to justify otherwise unjustifiable stops, and what multiple complainants had explicitly and directly termed obvious and undeniable racial profiling. But like far too many police departments across the country, Charlotte-Mecklenburg had developed over many years an institutional culture that systematically prioritized protecting its officers from accountability, rather than holding them accountable for protecting citizens' constitutional rights. None of Officer Curtis Langley's 18 complaints had resulted in any meaningful disciplinary consequences whatsoever. He had been verbally counseled in the past, with no documentation placed in his permanent file. He had attended diversity training sometime earlier, a program he later described to colleagues as political correctness nonsense. He had otherwise faced absolutely no consequences for a clear, documented, undeniable pattern of constitutional violations that had been reported by citizens again and again. Officer Curtis Langley stopped his approach approximately 2 feet from Agent Derek Harlan's door, positioning himself at a tactical angle that Agent Derek Harlan instantly recognized from his own extensive training as the specific positioning that is taught for high-risk vehicle approaches involving potentially armed and dangerous suspects. It was completely inappropriate and totally unjustified for what should have been a routine traffic stop of a vehicle that was displaying absolutely no signs of threat, danger, or criminal activity of any kind. The command that Officer Curtis Langley delivered was harsh and hostile, delivered without any greeting, without any explanation of the reason for the stop, without any of the basic professional courtesies that typically characterize normal law enforcement interactions with law-abiding citizens. It was simply a harsh demand for documents spoken in a tone that conveyed pure contempt and aggression rather than legitimate professional authority. Agent Derek Harlan responded calmly and professionally, keeping his voice level and respectful despite his growing internal concern about how this interaction was developing, explaining clearly that he would need to reach into his glove compartment to retrieve his vehicle registration and then reach into his pocket to retrieve his wallet containing his identification. I was deliberately telegraphing every movement in advance, which is a standard practice specifically designed to prevent any possible misunderstandings and to maintain maximum officer safety during any interaction. He retrieved the vehicle registration document from the glove compartment very slowly and carefully, holding it up clearly so Officer Curtis Langley could see exactly what he was holding, and then handed it through the open window with his left hand. Then he reached equally carefully with his right hand for his wallet, which contained both his North Carolina driver's license and his FBI credentials in a leather credential case with his official badge and identification card clearly visible through a transparent window in the case. The moment Agent Derek Harlan opened his wallet and the distinctive gold FBI badge became visible in the beam of light from Officer Curtis Langley's flashlight, Officer Curtis Langley's expression and demeanor should have changed completely and immediately, according to every standard of professional law enforcement practice. Any properly trained law enforcement officer anywhere in the United States recognizes instantly the significance of federal law enforcement credentials and the protocols that govern interactions with federal agents. The standard protocol that is taught in every police academy in the country is immediate de-escalation of the situation, professional verification of the credentials through official channels. If there exists any reasonable doubt about authenticity, extension of professional courtesy to a fellow law enforcement officer, and typically an apology for the inconvenience of the stop, along with an explanation that the stop was conducted in error. But Officer Curtis Langley's reaction was the complete opposite of what training and protocol and professional standards required. His face became noticeably harder and more set in its expression, his jaw visibly clenched with tension. His hand moved even closer to his holstered weapon in a way that Agent Derek Harlan found extremely alarming given the circumstances. And the words that came out of Officer Curtis Langley's mouth next, delivered in a tone of barely controlled hostility and aggressive confrontation, revealed with perfect clarity exactly what this traffic stop was really about. Officer Curtis Langley ordered Agent Derek Harlan to step out of the vehicle immediately. Agent Derek Harlan, maintaining his calm and measured tone while keeping his voice respectful despite his rapidly increasing concern about the situation, asked politely for clarification on the legal basis for that order. Under established case law, particularly the Supreme Court decision in Pennsylvania versus Mims, police officers do possess the legal authority to order drivers to exit vehicles during traffic stops, but that authority must be based on reasonable officer safety concerns or legitimate investigative needs related to suspected criminal activity. Agent Derek Harlan, sitting calmly with both hands clearly visible on his steering wheel, speaking respectfully and cooperatively, having already provided his credentials, clearly identifying himself as a federal law enforcement officer with no outstanding warrants or criminal history, presented absolutely no safety threat whatsoever, and there was no legitimate investigative reason that could possibly justify removing him from his vehicle. Officer Curtis Langley simply repeated his order, this time significantly louder and substantially more aggressive in tone and delivery. A second patrol car pulled up rapidly behind Officer Curtis Langley's cruiser with emergency lights flashing brightly in the growing darkness. A second officer emerged quickly from that vehicle and immediately moved with purpose to the passenger side of Agent Derek Harlan's Tahoe, pulling out a powerful flashlight and beginning to shine the bright beam through the windows, examining the vehicle's interior carefully and systematically as if actively searching for something specific. Agent Derek Harlan stepped out of his vehicle very slowly and deliberately, moving with extreme care and caution, maintaining the calm professionalism that his FBI service and countless confrontations with dangerous criminals had ingrained deeply into his character and behavioral patterns. He stood there on the shoulder of Interstate 77 in his professional work attire, charcoal gray suit pants that were slightly wrinkled from the long day, crisp white dress shirt with the sleeves now rolled up partway from hours of work, dark blue tie that was loosened slightly at the collar from fatigue and the heat of the day, and polished black Oxford shoes that were showing some dust from walking through the parking garage earlier. He looked exactly like precisely what he actually was in reality, a federal law enforcement professional who had just completed an extremely long day of important and demanding investigative work on a complex criminal case. But to Officer Curtis Langley, none of those obvious visual indicators registered or mattered in the slightest degree. The expensive suit, the professional demeanor, the federal credentials, the calm, respectful behavior, none of it made any difference at all. The only thing that Officer Curtis Langley appeared to see or process mentally was a black man driving an expensive vehicle who had shown him an FBI badge, which Officer Curtis Langley apparently interpreted not as legitimate federal credentials deserving of professional respect and courtesy, but rather as some kind of personal challenge to his authority that needed to be met with aggressive assertion of dominance and control. The order to place his hands on the hood of the Tahoe was delivered as a shout rather than spoken as a professional command. Agent Derek Harlan complied immediately without hesitation or argument. Assuming the physical position that he had personally observed countless criminal suspects assume during his own arrests in his FBI career. But there was one absolutely crucial difference that made this situation fundamentally and morally different from all of those arrests he had participated in. Every single one of those suspects had been under active investigation for actual crimes that they had actually committed, and for which substantial evidence existed. Agent Derek Harlan's only offense, his only action that had triggered this entire encounter and escalation, was the simple act of driving while black in an expensive vehicle through an affluent neighborhood. The pat-downs Officer Curtis Langley conducted on Agent Derek Harlan's person was unnecessarily rough and aggressive, with hands moving over his body with excessive force that went well beyond any legitimate and proper search for weapons or contraband. The second officer, whose name badge clearly identified him as Officer Bryce Nolan, began systematically searching the interior of Agent Derek Harlan's Tahoe without asking for any permission and without providing any legal justification whatsoever for conducting the search. Agent Derek Harlan stated clearly and calmly, speaking loudly enough that both officers and any nearby civilian witnesses could hear him distinctly and unambiguously, that he explicitly and formally did not consent to any search of his vehicle, that the vehicle contained federal law enforcement materials and case files that were protected by federal statute from unauthorized access, and that any search conducted without his explicit consent or without a properly obtained judicial warrant would constitute a clear and unconstitutional violation of his Fourth Amendment rights against unreasonable search and seizure. His clearly stated objections and legal arguments were completely and totally ignored by both officers, as if he had not spoken at all. Officer Bryce Nolan continued his systematic search of the vehicle, methodically opening the glove compartment and rifling through its contents, searching through the center console and examining items stored there, even reaching into the backseat area where Agent Derek Harlan's FBI work laptop computer sat in a professional leather shoulder bag, along with additional case files and investigative materials. Agent Derek Harlan informed both officers clearly and unambiguously that he had a service weapon secured in a biometric fingerprint safe mounted in the rear cargo area, that he was legally authorized under federal law to possess and carry that weapon as a federal law enforcement officer carrying out official duties, and that the safe could only be opened and accessed using his personal fingerprint for security purposes. Officer Curtis Langley moved purposefully to the rear of the vehicle, quickly located the biometric safe bolted to the floor, and demanded in a harsh tone that Agent Derek Harlan open it immediately. When Agent Derek Harlan complied and the Glock 22 was revealed inside the safe, exactly as Agent Derek Harlan had accurately described, Officer Curtis Langley lifted the weapon up and held it aloft in a dramatic manner that suggested he genuinely believed he had just discovered evidence of some kind of serious crime, rather than simply viewing the legally authorized duty weapon of a federal agent who was required by bureau policy to carry it. By this point in the escalating encounter, multiple customers at the nearby Quick Trip gas station had begun to notice the unusual and dramatic commotion taking place on the highway shoulder. Several of them, recognizing that something troubling appeared to be happening, had pulled out their smartphones and started recording video footage of the interaction. One woman, a paralegal named Elena Vargas, who happened to be filling her car with gas, began live streaming the encounter directly to her Facebook page. What those civilian cameras captured over the next several minutes from multiple angles and perspectives would prove to be absolutely crucial and completely decisive in everything that followed in the subsequent weeks and months. As the number of phones recording the encounter visibly increased and more witnesses gathered to watch, Officer Curtis Langley's behavior became even more erratic, aggressive, and deeply concerning. He seemed to recognize consciously that he was being filmed by multiple civilian witnesses, but rather than moderating his conduct to conform to proper professional standards as any reasonable officer would do, he appeared instead to double down on his aggression and hostility, perhaps feeling that he had gone too far to back down now without losing face. His face became visibly flushed with anger. His voice rose to what could only accurately be described as shouting rather than professional communication. His movements became jerky and tense in a way that clearly suggested barely controlled rage. The command to turn around and place his hands behind his back came as a complete shock to Agent Derek Harlan, despite all his years of experience dealing with confrontational situations. For the first time since the encounter began, his carefully maintained professional composure cracked slightly and visibly. He turned to face Officer Curtis Langley directly, looking him in the eyes, and asked in a clear voice what specific crime he was being charged with, what specific law he had allegedly violated, what legal basis existed under the Constitution for placing him under arrest. Officer Curtis Langley's answer was chilling in its complete vagueness and its disturbing implications for rule of law. He claimed without any specificity that Agent Derek Harlan was engaged in what he termed suspicious activity. When Agent Derek Harlan pressed him to specify exactly what activity he found suspicious, Officer Curtis Langley provided no coherent answer whatsoever. When Agent Derek Harlan asked directly what specific criminal statute he had allegedly violated that would justify an arrest, Officer Curtis Langley stated dismissively that they would figure all of that out later at the police station after booking. Within seconds, Agent Derek Harlan felt the cold, hard metal of handcuffs being ratcheted tightly around both of his wrists behind his back. The metal dug painfully into his skin, tighter than was necessary for any legitimate security purpose, tight enough to immediately begin cutting off proper blood circulation to his hands and leave deep marks and abrasions that would still be clearly visible on his wrists days later. A decorated FBI special agent with distinguished service, a man who had dedicated his entire adult professional career to upholding federal law and protecting citizens' constitutional rights, was now being unlawfully detained on the side of a public highway for no articulable legal reason whatsoever. Officer Bryce Nolan continued his systematic search of Agent Derek Harlan's Tahoe, now focusing his attention on the locked aluminum briefcase that contained the federal fraud case materials Agent Derek Harlan had been working on all day. Agent Derek Harlan informed both officers repeatedly and clearly, raising his voice to ensure he could be heard over the highway traffic noise, that the briefcase contained classified law enforcement documents, that federal law under Title 18, United States Code Section 641, explicitly prohibited unauthorized persons from accessing those materials, that they were actively committing a federal crime by examining those files without proper authorization from the FBI. Officer Curtis Langley finally told Officer Bryce Nolan curtly to leave the briefcase alone, apparently recognizing at last that tampering with active FBI case files might create legal problems that even the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Police Department's notoriously protective institutional culture might not be able to easily dismiss or cover up through its usual mechanisms. Agent Derek Harlan was physically placed in the back seat of Officer Curtis Langley's patrol car, hands cuffed tightly behind his back in a way that made any comfortable position impossible. Forced to sit awkwardly on the hard, molded plastic seat that was deliberately designed more for punishment and discomfort than for anything resembling humane treatment of human beings. The seat was positioned in such a way that his knees pressed uncomfortably against the metal cage barrier separating the back seat from the front. Through the window, he could clearly see the phones of civilian witnesses still held up and recording, still capturing every single moment of his unlawful detention for posterity. He could see customers at the Quick Trip gas station, standing in small groups of 2 or 3 watching the scene intently with obvious concern on their faces. some of them clearly on their phones, presumably, either calling the incident into authorities or uploading their video footage in real time to social media platforms like Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, or TikTok. The minutes crawled by with agonizing slowness that made every second feel like an hour of torment. Agent Derek Harlan's wrists burned intensely where the overly tight handcuffs cut into his skin, the metal edges digging into his flesh. His shoulders ached painfully from the unnatural position of having his arms pulled behind his back and held there immobile. His back screamed in protest from the uncomfortable forced posture on the hard plastic seat, but more than any physical discomfort, more than any bodily pain, what truly ate at him with corrosive intensity was the complete and total injustice of the entire situation, and the terrible realization of how differently this encounter would have gone if he had been white, if he had been driving a different, less expensive vehicle. If these particular officers had been willing to see him as a colleague in law enforcement, rather than as some kind of threat that needed to be aggressively controlled and dominated solely because of the color of his skin. Agent Derek Harlan requested multiple times, speaking clearly and politely each time, despite his growing anger and frustration, to speak with a supervisor, to contact the FBI field office to verify his credentials and identity, to be informed what specific criminal charges he was facing that justified this arrest. Each and every request was denied without explanation or justification. Officer Curtis Langley and Officer Bryce Nolan were standing outside the patrol car now, at a distance, conducting what appeared from their animated body language to be a somewhat heated discussion about something important. Their gestures and facial expressions, clearly visible through the car window, suggested disagreement or argument about some aspect of the situation. Quite possibly about how they were going to justify this traffic stop and arrest in their official reports when they knew they had no legitimate basis for either action. After some agonizing time had passed, a supervisor finally arrived on scene in a third patrol vehicle. Sergeant Owen Carver was a veteran of the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Police Department who had observed enough questionable traffic stops during his long career to recognize immediately when something had gone seriously and problematically wrong with an interaction. He personally and carefully examined Agent Derek Harlan's Tahoe with his own eyes, methodically checking the tail lights that Officer Curtis Langley had initially claimed in his radio traffic to dispatch were malfunctioning and had provided his stated justification for the initial stop. Both tail lights functioned absolutely perfectly, illuminating brightly and clearly when Sergeant Owen Carver had Officer Bryce Nolan activate the vehicle's light switch to test them. There was no malfunction, no burnt bulb, no wiring problem, nothing wrong whatsoever. Sergeant Owen Carver retrieved and reviewed Officer Curtis Langley's dashcam footage and body camera recordings, watching them carefully and thoroughly in his own vehicle for several long minutes while Agent Derek Harlan remained handcuffed uncomfortably in the back of Officer Curtis Langley's patrol car, unable to move. What Sergeant Owen Carver observed on those recordings was absolutely damning from both a legal and professional standpoint. No traffic violation of any kind visible on the video. No reasonable suspicion of criminal activity articulated before or during the stop. No probable cause established for either a search or an arrest. Just a black man driving an expensive vehicle who had been stopped without cause, searched without consent, and arrested without justification. Sergeant Owen Carver had an extended private conversation with Officer Curtis Langley at the rear of the patrol cars that Agent Derek Harlan could not hear clearly from inside the vehicle, but whose intensity and serious nature was completely obvious even from a distance, based solely on the body language and facial expressions that were clearly visible through the window. Sergeant Owen Carver appeared to be seriously and angrily dressing down Officer Curtis Langley, gesturing emphatically with his hands, his face showing what looked like barely controlled anger and deep frustration at what his subordinate officer had done. Sergeant Owen Carver then approached the patrol car where Agent Derek Harlan sat confined and uncomfortable, opened the rear door allowing fresh air to enter the stuffy interior, and spoke words that were clearly difficult and uncomfortable for him to say to another law enforcement officer. I informed Agent Derek Harlan formally that he was being released immediately, that he was free to go, that there had been what Sergeant Owen Carver very carefully termed a misunderstanding regarding the traffic stop, that the detention was being terminated with immediate effect. Agent Derek Harlan looked directly at Sergeant Owen Carver with an expression that conveyed simultaneously both complete physical exhaustion and barely concealed contempt for what had just been done to him by officers of the law. I noted aloud in a voice loud enough for the witnesses still recording to hear that misunderstanding was an extremely interesting and carefully chosen word to describe what any reasonable objective observer would immediately recognize as obvious racial profiling and false arrest without probable cause. He held up his wrists to show Sergeant Owen Carver the deep red marks and minor bleeding where the overly tight handcuffs had cut into his skin during the prolonged detention. He gestured toward his Tahoe with his head, whose interior now looked as if a small tornado had passed directly through it. With papers scattered randomly across the seats, his briefcase opened and its sensitive contents rifled through and examined, his personal belongings strewn about and carelessly without any respect for his property or privacy. Sergeant Owen Carver had no substantive response to offer except to remove the handcuffs from Agent Derek Harlan's abraded wrists and repeat somewhat lamely that Agent Derek Harlan was free to leave and return home. No apology was offered for the violation of his rights. No explanation was provided about what supposed traffic violation had justified the initial stop in the first place. No acknowledgement was made of the multiple constitutional violations that had just occurred over the past hour. Just a simple dismissal delivered in an uncomfortable tone, as if the past period of completely unlawful detention had been merely a minor inconvenience or small mistake, rather than a serious federal civil rights violation with potential criminal implications. But as Agent Derek Harlan slowly and stiffly gathered his scattered belongings from where they had been, carelessly tossed around his vehicle and attempted to restore some minimal semblance of order to his thoroughly searched Tahoe, he knew with absolute certainty that this matter was very far from over. These officers had made what would prove to be a catastrophic error in judgment. They had unlawfully detained a federal agent without any legitimate cause or justification. They had searched his vehicle without proper consent or warrant. They had examined federal case materials without any authorization. And they had done absolutely all of it directly in front of multiple civilian witnesses with smartphones who had carefully and thoroughly documented everything that had occurred from beginning to end. They had, in words that would later dominate social media discussions and news coverage for weeks, picked exactly the wrong black man to target with their racially motivated harassment and unconstitutional policing. By the following morning, the story had exploded spectacularly across every major social media platform with a speed and intensity that surprised even experienced observers of viral content. Multiple witnesses from the Quick Trip gas station had uploaded their video recordings to Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok during the night. Many of them adding hashtags like Black Lives Matter, police accountability, racial profiling, and FBI to increase visibility and reach. The videos had been filmed from several different angles and perspectives, creating an extremely comprehensive visual record of the encounter that left absolutely no room whatsoever for alternative interpretations or creative, after-the-fact justifications. Elena Vargas, the paralegal who had live-streamed the encounter on Facebook, woke up to discover that her live-stream had been viewed millions of times overnight and had been shared tens of thousands of times. Her phone was flooded with notifications, messages, and friend requests from people she had never met. Local news stations were calling asking for interviews. The footage clearly and unambiguously showed Agent Derek Harlan's Tahoe being pulled over on the interstate, despite no visible traffic violation of any kind occurring on camera. It showed Agent Derek Harlan being ordered out of his vehicle despite his obvious calm compliance with every instruction given. It showed the aggressive pat-down search conducted by Officer Curtis Langley with excessive force. It showed Agent Derek Harlan's FBI credentials being examined by Officer Curtis Langley and then apparently dismissed as either fake or irrelevant. It showed Agent Derek Harlan being handcuffed roughly and physically placed in the patrol car. It showed his vehicle being systematically searched without his consent despite his clear verbal objections. And perhaps most damning of all from a public perception standpoint, the videos showed Agent Derek Harlan's remarkable professional composure maintained throughout the entire ordeal. His calm, respectful demeanor and cooperative behavior, even as his constitutional rights were being systematically and deliberately violated by officers who absolutely should have known better. The videos went viral with absolutely stunning speed that exceeded anything the witnesses had anticipated. Within a short time of the first upload, the combined footage from all the different witnesses had been viewed millions of times across all platforms. Comments flooded in by the tens of thousands expressing outrage, recognition of similar personal experiences, and loud demands for immediate accountability and justice. Many commenters specifically noted and praised how Agent Derek Harlan's professional, calm demeanor in the face of such obvious injustice and violation demonstrated both remarkable self-control and a heartbreaking familiarity with exactly this type of discriminatory treatment that suggested he had experienced similar encounters before. Other major national civil rights organizations, including the NAACP, the ACLU, and the National Urban League, shared the videos widely with extensive commentary about how this incident illustrated perfectly the harsh reality that no amount of professional success, no federal credentials or badges, no perfect compliance with instructions, no respectful behavior can protect Black Americans from racial profiling by police officers who see skin color as grounds for suspicion. Legal analysts and professors from major law schools, including Harvard, Yale, and Georgetown, weighed in publicly on cable news and in newspaper op-eds about the multiple clear constitutional violations visible in the footage. Law enforcement experts, former police chiefs, and retired FBI agents from around the country appeared on television and wrote articles criticizing Officer Curtis Langley and Officer Bryce Nolan's conduct as completely indefensible under any reasonable interpretation of proper professional police procedures or constitutional law. By the next day, every major news outlet in the country was running the story as headline news. CNN, MSNBC, Fox News, ABC, NBC, CBS, all of them led their broadcast with footage of a decorated FBI agent being handcuffed on a highway shoulder for absolutely no discernible, legitimate reason, while civilian witnesses captured it all on video. The Charlotte Observer newspaper ran a front-page story above the fold under the banner headline, FBI agent detained in apparent case of racial profiling. The New York Times published a detailed analysis piece examining the incident in the broader national context of well-documented patterns of racial profiling in traffic stops nationwide, citing academic studies and Department of Justice statistics. The Washington Post ran a strongly worded editorial explicitly calling for federal intervention in the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Police Department and comprehensive police reform legislation at both state and federal levels. The FBI's Charlotte Field Office issued an official statement by the afternoon that confirmed Agent Derek Harlan's identity and his status as a special agent in good standing with distinguished service. The statement was carefully worded by FBI attorneys to avoid prejudging the ongoing situation, but the implications were absolutely clear to anyone who read it carefully. One of their agents, a decorated investigator with an exemplary record, had been subjected to completely unlawful detention by local police officers, and the Bureau took such matters extremely seriously and would not let this incident be quietly swept under the rug. The statement specifically noted that the FBI director had been personally briefed on the incident first thing that morning, and that the Bureau was monitoring the situation very closely and considering all available legal options to ensure accountability and justice. The Charlotte-Mecklenburg Police Department suddenly found itself in the middle of a full-blown public relations and legal crisis unlike anything it had faced in recent memory. The police chief, recognizing the severity of the situation and the intense public scrutiny being applied, hastily called an emergency press conference that afternoon. Appearing before an absolutely packed room of reporters from local and national news organizations, television cameras from every major network, and community activists who had rushed to attend. He characterized the officer's behavior as completely unacceptable and contrary to department policy and values, announced that both Officer Curtis Langley and Officer Bryce Nolan had been immediately placed on administrative leave pending a thorough and comprehensive investigation by Internal Affairs, promised complete transparency throughout the investigative process, and expressed what he characterized as his personal regret for what had occurred and the damage done to community trust. But FBI Special Agent Derek Harlan was absolutely not satisfied with press conferences, carefully worded statements, and administrative leave. He understood law enforcement culture and institutional self-protection mechanisms far too well to believe that without sustained external pressure and serious legal consequences, officers like Officer Curtis Langley and Officer Bryce Nolan would very likely be quietly reinstated to full duty once media attention inevitably faded to the next controversy or scandal. I had witnessed this exact pattern play out far too many times during his career investigating civil rights violations and police misconduct cases. Agent Derek Harlan contacted the FBI's Office of Professional Responsibility within a day of the incident and filed an extremely detailed formal complaint through proper federal channels, documenting every aspect of the encounter with the precision and thoroughness that his investigative experience had taught him. He also retained one of the most respected and successful civil rights attorneys in the entire state of North Carolina, a lawyer named Damon Fletcher, who had built his professional reputation over years by prosecuting high-profile police misconduct cases and had secured substantial settlements along with comprehensive consent decrees requiring sweeping departmental reforms. Together, Agent Derek Harlan and Damon Fletcher began building not merely a complaint or a simple lawsuit, but rather a comprehensive federal civil rights case designed to force genuine institutional accountability and create lasting systemic change that would protect future drivers from similar violations. The federal lawsuit was filed sometime after the incident in the United States District Court for the Western District of North Carolina under Title 42, United States Code Section 1983. The critical civil rights statute that allows citizens to sue government officials for constitutional violations. The complaint named as defendants: Officer Curtis Langley, individually; Officer Bryce Nolan, individually; Sergeant Owen Carver in his supervisory capacity; and the City of Charlotte-Mecklenburg as the employing municipality. The legal claims alleged included violations of the Fourth Amendment's protections against unreasonable search and seizure, violations of the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause, false arrest and false imprisonment, assault and battery under color of law, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and negligent hiring, training, and supervision by the city. The complaint sought compensatory damages for the constitutional violations, pain and suffering, and emotional distress, punitive damages against the individual officers to deter future misconduct, and most importantly from Agent Derek Harlan's perspective, comprehensive injunctive relief requiring fundamental reforms to department policies and practices. The discovery process that followed the filing revealed patterns and practices that should have been identified and addressed by responsible department leadership years earlier. Officer Curtis Langley's complete personnel file, obtained through formal discovery requests and ultimately produced under court order after the city initially resisted disclosure, revealed a disturbing and extensively documented history spanning his career. 18 formal complaints filed against Officer Curtis Langley over the years, 16 of those complaints specifically involving black motorists, all describing remarkably and suspiciously similar patterns of conduct, including pretextual traffic stops initiated without legitimate cause, aggressive and hostile demeanor towards stopped drivers, unwarranted vehicle searches conducted without proper consent or probable cause, false accusations of traffic violations or suspicious behavior designed specifically to justify otherwise unjustifiable stops, and what multiple complainants had explicitly and directly termed in their written statements obvious and undeniable racial profiling based solely on skin color. Yet, Despite this extensively documented pattern of constitutional violations reported by citizens again and again, none of Officer Curtis Langley's 18 complaints had resulted in any meaningful disciplinary consequences whatsoever beyond the most minimal responses. Internal affairs investigations of the complaints had been superficial and perfunctory at best, with complaints routinely dismissed as unsubstantiated or not credible unless there existed absolutely incontrovertible video evidence that made denial impossible. And even when limited video evidence was available, it was sometimes creatively explained away through reasoning that always gave maximum benefit of doubt to the officer. Officer Curtis Langley had been allowed to continue actively patrolling, conducting discretionary traffic stops, and violating citizens' constitutional rights year after year because the department's deeply embedded institutional culture systematically and deliberately prioritized protecting officers from accountability over protecting the constitutional rights of the citizens those officers were sworn to serve. The discovery process also uncovered internal email communications between supervisors that proved devastating to the city's legal defense. Multiple email chains showed clearly that supervisors, including Sergeant Owen Carver and higher-ranking commanders, had explicitly discussed Officer Curtis Langley's troubling complaint pattern on several occasions over a period of years, but had made conscious administrative decisions not to take any meaningful corrective action unless and until Officer Curtis Langley did something so egregious and publicly visible that it generated significant negative media attention that could not be ignored, dismissed, or managed through the department's usual public relations mechanisms. One particularly damning email from a shift commander, written sometime before Agent Derek Harlan's detention, actually acknowledged that Officer Curtis Langley had developed a concerning pattern of complaints from minority drivers, but concluded that aggressive proactive policing was simply Officer Curtis Langley's personal enforcement style, and that citizen complaints were inevitably going to occur whenever officers took a genuinely proactive approach to law enforcement, rather than simply responding reactively to calls for service. The deposition testimony from Officer Curtis Langley himself, taken under oath over days of intensive questioning by Damon Fletcher, provided additional damning evidence of both his individual misconduct and the department's systemic failures to address it. Under oath and subject to penalties for perjury, Officer Curtis Langley struggled visibly and failed completely to articulate any coherent, legitimate law enforcement reason for initiating the traffic stop of Agent Derek Harlan's vehicle. He first claimed under direct examination that Agent Derek Harlan had been driving significantly over the posted speed limit, but when pressed by Damon Fletcher to provide any radar readings, LiDAR measurements, or other objective evidence to support that claim of speeding, Officer Curtis Langley was forced to admit that no such evidence existed because he had not actually used any speed detection equipment before initiating the stop. I then pivoted awkwardly to claiming that one of Agent Derek Harlan's tail lights had been visibly malfunctioning, but when confronted during cross-examination with multiple videos from different angles showing both tail lights functioning perfectly throughout the entire encounter, he was forced to abandon that justification as well, and appeared flustered and evasive. Officer Bryce Nolan's deposition testimony proved similarly damaging to the defense. He admitted candidly under questioning that he had no independent personal basis for believing the traffic stop was legally justified, that he had simply responded quickly to Officer Curtis Langley's radio call requesting backup without any personal knowledge of what had initially triggered the stop, or whether it was based on legitimate grounds. When Damon Fletcher asked Officer Bryce Nolan to explain why he had immediately begun searching Agent Derek Harlan's vehicle without first asking for permission or establishing probable cause, Officer Bryce Nolan claimed he was conducting what he termed a protective sweep, looking for weapons or contraband that might pose a threat to officer safety. But when pressed to articulate what specific observable facts had given him reasonable suspicion to believe weapons or contraband were present in the vehicle, Officer Bryce Nolan offered only vague and unconvincing assertions that the vehicle and the driver's behavior had seemed somehow suspicious to him, without being able to define what specifically had been suspicious about a properly registered and legally operated vehicle. or about a driver who was sitting calmly with his hands visible while speaking respectfully and cooperatively. The statistical evidence compiled and meticulously analyzed by Agent Derek Harlan's legal team in preparation for trial showed patterns of discriminatory enforcement that were mathematically impossible to explain as random chance or coincidence. Over the period immediately preceding Agent Derek Harlan's unlawful detention, Officer Curtis Langley had personally conducted 247 traffic stops according to department records. Of those stops, 203 had involved black drivers, despite the fact that black drivers represented only approximately 35% of motorists on the specific routes and during the specific shifts that Officer Curtis Langley was regularly assigned to patrol. Officer Curtis Langley had conducted vehicle searches in 127 of those 247 stops, finding contraband in only 19 instances, producing a success rate of less than 15%, that strongly suggested he was engaging in unconstitutional fishing expeditions rather than conducting searches based on actual probable cause as required by the Fourth Amendment. Officer Bryce Nolan's enforcement statistics showed a remarkably similar, troubling pattern. 189 traffic stops over the same period, 156 involving black drivers. Vehicle searches conducted in 94 cases. Contraband discovered in only 12 instances. The mathematical probability of these racial disparities occurring purely by random chance, according to expert statistical analysis commissioned by Agent Derek Harlan's attorneys and performed by a professor of statistics from Duke University, was calculated at less than 1 in 100,000. Some time after the incident, after extensive and often contentious negotiations between the parties and with trial rapidly approaching on the court's calendar, the case reached a comprehensive settlement agreement. The city of Charlotte-Mecklenburg agreed to pay Agent Derek Harlan $2.1 million in monetary damages, one of the largest settlement amounts in the city's history for a police misconduct case involving a single incident. But from Agent Derek Harlan's perspective throughout the negotiations, the monetary compensation, while substantial and appropriate, was far less important than the comprehensive injunctive relief that the settlement agreement required the department to implement under court supervision. The consent decree mandated sweeping reforms. The department implemented sophisticated early warning systems using statistical analysis to identify officers whose traffic stop patterns showed racial disparities unexplainable by legitimate factors. Officers flagged by the system underwent immediate mandatory retraining on implicit bias in constitutional policing. 30 days of ride-along supervision and transfer to non-traffic positions if patterns persisted. Quarterly statistical analysis of all stop data by independent researchers would be published in accessible public databases. Performance evaluations were restructured, completely eliminating arrest quotas and instead rewarding constitutional compliance, community satisfaction, appropriate discretion, and de-escalation outcomes. A civilian review board with 7 members was established representing diverse community perspectives, including civil rights advocacy and lived justice system experience. The board received dedicated investigative staff, independent legal counsel, and subpoena power. It could recommend discipline from counseling to termination with recommendations binding, unless the chief provided detailed public written justification subject to city council review. Body camera policies were comprehensively overhauled. All patrol officers required cameras activated at every enforcement encounter's beginning, deactivated only after complete conclusion. Unexplained activation failures created rebuttable presumptions of misconduct, concealment, with serious disciplinary consequences. Training requirements expanded to scenario-based de-escalation. Implicit bias incorporating psychological research, constitutional policing covering recent case law, and annual mandatory refreshers. Officer Curtis Langley and Officer Bryce Nolan were both terminated permanently. Officer Curtis Langley appealed through the union, but the arbitrator upheld termination in a detailed decision finding his conduct legally indefensible and his pattern statistically extreme. Agent Derek Harlan donated $1.8 million to police accountability organizations and established scholarships for underserved students pursuing justice careers. Later measurable results demonstrated reform effectiveness. Black driver stops decreased 38%, while white driver stops increased 19%. Searches decreased 47%, but hit rates increased from 14 to 31%. Complaints alleging bias dropped 61%. Community trust surveys show dramatic improvement with Black residents trusting fair treatment rising from 19 to 58%. Agent Derek Harlan was promoted to Supervisory Special Agent in FBI Civil Rights Division, investigating police misconduct nationwide and bringing both expertise and lived experience to that critical work protecting constitutional rights. If you believe no one should be stopped, searched, or arrested based on skin color, hit subscribe. Tomorrow's story proves even those dedicating lives to law enforcement can become victims of unlawful policing and what happens when they fight back for justice and accountability.